Well, I'd like to see if I can understand sort of where motivational interviewing came from and where it might be going. Let me begin with this question. How did you two come up with the idea of motivational interviewing?
He did.
Well, I learned it from my clients, but I had the fortunate experience of a sabbatical leave in Norway and the experience of training some very bright, capable young psychologists there who asked me to demonstrate what it was that I do with clients. And in the process of doing so, they would stop me and ask me, what are you thinking here? Why are you saying this and not something else? And why are you going in this direction, not some other direction? And required me really to verbalize the implicit rules underneath what my clients had taught me to do. And I didn't really expect that to go anywhere. In fact, I didn't even expect that paper to be published. But I was persuaded to publish it, and that gave a start to at least this thought that there is a way you can interact with your clients to enhance intrinsic motivation.
So you had all these ideas inside of you and kind of already percolating, and then you ran into Steve.
Yes, we on actually a second sabbatical in Australia, I had the good fortune of meeting Steve and discovered that he had also been developing these ideas in his own training and work. And we found that we were thinking along very similar lines, although we had developed independently before that. Mm-hmm. And that was a collaboration that led to our writing a book together.
I'd come from the United Kingdom, where quite a sizable number of us colleagues had taken up motivational interviewing and were attempting to teach it. Mm-hmm. And when I first met Bill, I remember saying to him that he should take this much more seriously than he has. I think it was the first time we met, and that he should really write a book on it, because there are elements of the original paper that needed serious amplification. And I suppose that's what started it off for us. But it was certainly a very powerful force in addictions treatment and alcohol treatment in the UK well before we met. Mm-hmm. That early 1983 paper went round a sizable chunk of addiction treatment units in the United Kingdom in the middle 80s. You know.
Which was frightening, because I hadn't anticipated it would have that kind of circulation. And when Steve said, you need to write more, I said, help me. And so we began working together.
So what changes have you seen in motivational interviewing since the two of you kind of put your heads together and knocked out your book?
Certainly is being applied in a lot of areas that I hadn't anticipated. When we worked together initially, we were thinking mostly about addictive behaviors. The idea arose working with alcohol problems. Spread fairly quickly to other drug problems, but what we're seeing now is application to many other areas, and Steve in particular has been very important in developing applications of this in medical settings.
Yes, I've been immersed in that since we wrote the book, and the potential application seems to become ever broader because of the obvious observation that what we wrote about in the book were difficult discussions about behavior change, which are pervasive in healthcare settings. But one also has a sense of potential for application to other areas which are really badly in need of, as Bill would probably put it, of being humanized. And the criminal justice system is one such example where there are quite dysfunctional discussions about behavior change, let's put it that way. So the changes that I've noticed have been mostly, as Bill said, about broadening of application, and the privilege of meeting people in different parts of the world, colleagues in different parts of the world, who've used it so imaginatively. Accidents and emergency settings, 2 to 3 minutes. Treatments of sexual offenders. Very wide range of settings. And it seems like the common element is difficult discussion about behavior change.
That's one thing that strikes me. It hasn't been effortful to disseminate this, to get this out there and have people pick it up. It's more the opportunity to come to both of us. I hadn't expected at all criminal justice system inquiries, and we're getting quite a few of those. One of the largest groups dealing with family abuse, domestic violence, came to us and is now using motivational interviewing as a way of getting an entree to families that are in a very stressful situation. And so the applications other people keep finding, and we're happy to discuss those and be part of it, but it almost has taken on a life of its own, and that's interesting.
Why is that, do you think? What do you think makes motivational interviewing intriguing to people or interesting to them?
I guess I do think of it as humanizing. I do think of it as getting you past technique, past just the client-therapist or doctor-patient relationship, and dealing with the person that's there. And that's very appealing to both sides. It's certainly appealing to the consumers of health services because they're being dealt with as a person and being actively involved in their own care, and that's quite attractive. But it's interesting also that professionals find this so attractive because it seems to decrease burnout. That rather than struggling against people to make them do the things that you know they need to do and being frustrated at why they won't do these things that they need to do to get better, it's a collaborative process. So there's not such a burden on the professional to feel like he or she must make the person do something. And you go home at the end of the day tired still, but not with that sense of frustration and an adversarial relationship with the people that you serve.
Yes, and to put it negatively, frustration is a very common experience in so many different kinds of settings and encounters. And it seemed like there were only models of individual behavior change. Most of the theory focused on that. And motivational interviewing seems to have helped bridge that gap between the everyday clinical encounter and the frustrations of working with behavior change on the one hand, and the world of theory and models on the other hand, like the stages of change model. It seems to have struck a chord with people in their everyday life, and that's a great pleasure if that's happened.
It speaks to a need, and it speaks to a frustration that is pretty common in medicine and psychology and many other disciplines, to help people first develop a commitment to change and then help them along the way. And when you're trying to help someone before they've reached that point of commitment and resolve the ambivalence about changing, it's difficult. It's much more like a struggle.
In my own work, I've noticed that motivational interviewing is interestingly related to cynicism, in that if you're too entrenched in cynicism, it's difficult to learn, and yet it can itself be an antidote sometimes for cynicism in health providers and people who are struggling to help people change behaviors.
Doing this changes people. I have jokes sometimes we should have an informed consent before we train people in motivational interviewing, because it begins to change the person you are. It's not a series of techniques fundamentally. It's a way of being with people, and that way of being with people changes who you are as well.
So is there a difference then between the spirit of motivational interviewing and the techniques that people need to learn to be able to do it?
Yes, I think we'd both agree that the spirit is something which you could more or less define and is enduring and is the most important. Technical and strategic matters flow from that.
I see a large difference, and it's like the words in the music, and it's the music of motivational interviewing that sometimes is a little hard to teach. The words are the techniques, but to understand what's underneath it, what is the view of humankind that underlies this way of approaching things, is also quite important. It's a collaborative view. It's a view that within the person with whom you're working, there's great wisdom. There are resources to be allied with as a co-therapist or co-healer, if you will. It's a very respectful approach. It's one that suspends your own individual identity for the time being to merge with and understand something about the other person. And if you don't have that spirit, it sounds empty. If you look at a transcript, perhaps it even looks somewhat the same, but there's something missing in that. Now, I think the good news is that nonetheless the Spirit is teachable, and that using some of the technique kinds of things that we have described can move you in a direction of having that kind of relationship with people and having that appreciation. Just listening well to people teaches you about people and increases your respect for people. And so they interplay, the Spirit and the technique. But what we're wanting to emphasize, I think, is that the spirit of it is fundamental and is a good deal more than just a set of tricks or techniques that one uses.
And it's also, I think, a good deal more than a counseling style, because when behavior change is discussed, prickly feelings arise. Will I, won't I, should I, shouldn't I, how do I, do you want me to, who else wants me to? These sort of questions arise which require delicate handling. And if the spirit is foregone or put aside, and these are dealt with as technical matters, difficulties will arise. And neither of us are keen on presenting motivational interviewing as a set of techniques or strategies for that reason. And these difficulties are clinical resistance from the patient, various manifestations of disrespect, if you like, ethical difficulties. So I agree with everything you're saying. I think the spirit is very important. There will be cultural differences in different parts of the world, I suspect, as to how important people view that. And I think in a North American context, this word spirit goes down fine. Mm-hmm. And there might be other cultural environments where people will think, are we talking about some kind of religion here? And, I don't mean us to discuss that in great detail, but I think, you've captured the way you've described it, as I agree with, really. And if you think it doesn't exist, have a look at some of the clinical scenarios we might show in these videos, and let's hope we capture it.
Mm-hmm. We've talked a bit about behavior change, and we talked a bit about resistance. Steve, I'm wondering, what do you see as the conceptual underpinnings for motivational interviewing? What do you think is really happening?
I think it's useful to realize that it isn't a model or a theory. It's a method, exactly as you put it. It's a method that uses different conceptual models as an aid to understanding behavior change discussions. So there for me are the parameters, the conceptual outline is behavior change. Now, Bill might disagree because he's talked about decision making, which is a separate discussion. But for me, it's behavior change in an interpersonal context. And so there's two broad conceptual foundations. One of them is the interpersonal context, and as you probably realize, Bill's talked about Rogerian client-centered counseling as being one of the conceptual underpinnings. From a behavior change point of view, I think the problem is that one is spoiled for choice, because there's a lot of work on individual behavior change. There's not a lot of work on behavior change discussed between two people. But in models of individual behavior change, there are a lot of them, and we're spoiled for choice. And there's no sense in which those that we've emphasized are necessarily the most important ones. But we have looked at this concept of ambivalence as being particularly useful, and a number of others. So I see those two key elements to the conceptual foundations: the individual behavior change on the one hand, and the interpersonal matters on the other.
It's very much about what happens between people, about relationship and the way in which two people respond to each other. So how we think about motivation, you can't really talk out of the context of relationship. Same thing with denial or resistance. It doesn't exist outside the context of a relationship. And in that regard, I was certainly profoundly influenced by Carl Rogers and his insights and wisdom into the creating of a safe atmosphere within which to explore difficult material. Rogers was actually fairly directive in what he did. He didn't talk about it that way, but his own students were able to demonstrate that he was fairly differentially responding to certain things that people would say. And we've tried to just make that more explicit and be more clear about the directive use of a client-centered approach. And so it's a sort of unique blending of ways of thinking about things.
I think so. I think there has been a serious errors been made in writing about psychotherapy where non-directive has been associated with client-centered as if they're the same thing. And I think that's a mistake. Rogers might have been classified that way, but there were directive elements to what he's doing. And I think because, from a technical point of view, because behavior change is such an itchy subject, directiveness is essential. Hence the need to combine client-centered with directive.
So the thing about motivational interviewing is that it is both client-centered and yet directive.
Another conceptual piece that was very helpful to me was self-perception theory, especially as described by Darrell Bem, and the idea that one's attitudes and behavioral intentions are shaped by the act of talking. And so the last thing that a doctor, a physician, or a therapist would want to do is to defend the positive or change side of the argument and cause the client or the patient to defend the side of the argument that there's no need for change, because the words then coming out of the client's mouth are, I don't have a problem, I don't need to change. And you want precisely the opposite to happen from that. It's an easy trap to fall into, and we'll look at it more as we get to the opening strategies tape. But it was very helpful to me to realize what you want is for the client to be verbalizing the reasons for change, to make the arguments for behavior change.
And that's the value of and the importance of having the emphasis on eliciting self-motivational statements.
Yes, that's right, as one of the fundamental principles.
If I can switch back to the individual psychology domain, a very helpful conceptual framework has been self-efficacy theory for me. Now, there is overlap between elements of self-efficacy theory and a range of value expectancy theories, but to put it in simple language, the question of can I do it, have I got the skills, self-efficacy on the one hand, and the question of should I, why should I, who says, on the other hand, I think these two questions are central, and I found them very useful from a conceptual point of view. I think it's a mistake, it's a misconception to perceive motivational interviewing as only pertaining to the latter one. Should I or shouldn't I change? I think people, when we talk to clients about how can I do it, there's hesitation, there's motivational difficulties. And so I think it's quite useful to see both of these together as underpinning these difficult behavior change discussions, where resistance can arise, motivational difficulties can arrive. And indeed, one might argue, although we didn't in the book, that the concept of ambivalence has been too narrowly restricted to only one of these domains, that I might be ambivalent about changing my behavior because of concern about my competence or my self-efficacy. So I think Bandura has done himself a disservice by not emphasizing the outcome expectancy concept enough, because I think in these difficult behavior change discussions, and particularly where people are at earlier stages of change, the should I, shouldn't I do it, why should I do it is much more important a question. It's not just a skill deficit problem. And so...
but eventually they come to the point where they might say something like, if I knew I could do it, I might go ahead.
In natural language, one says, I'm ready, willing, and able to change. And we've both been fascinated by those three concepts. And this is the able part. That if one doesn't see that it's possible, one's not likely to proceed toward behavior change. But there also is the will element of it, and there's the readiness element of it. And we're trying, in what we do with motivational interviewing, to pull those together.
Yep. So it's a mistake, conceptually, to think of motivational interviewing as only being useful for answering the should I, shouldn't I question.
And that sort of fits into some confusion that there's sometimes been about the influence of the stages of change model on motivational interviewing and exactly how those two things interface. Steve, I wonder if you could start out by discussing that.
Well, I think they both arose at around about the same time and are complementary in the nicest sort of way. The stages of change model struck a chord with practitioners, I think not because they suddenly realized they could match each individual at a particular stage with a particular kind of intervention. I think it was deeper or broader than that. It was attractive to them because they finally understood, I see, this is why people don't change. There's loads of them aren't ready for it. I think that was the basic thing. And if you provide too much action talk to people who are not ready for it, you're going to get resistance. Then that observation about an interpersonal process was precisely what we realized when we sat down and tried to put the book together, was that the Stages of Change framework is extremely useful for understanding successful and unsuccessful, or functional and dysfunctional encounters about behavior change.
Yeah. It's a very nice, clear, descriptive model for the process. That change isn't just a single event, but is a sequence of events that people move through, and it fits nicely with what we're doing, because motivational interviewing is useful in helping people move along from one point to the next. I think underneath the stages are these waves of processes of readiness, willingness, ability, and others, pros and cons, balancing. And we're just beginning to understand what is it that makes up a stage, or what is it that moves a person from one to the next. But it's a wonderful descriptive model for thinking about how to help people change. And because they arose about the same time, they've had a kind of natural siblingship in the field. And I think that's good.
Do you think there's any confusion on the part of people who think motivational interviewing shouldn't be used when people are in the action stage or in the maintenance stage, similar to the confusion you were talking about earlier, that motivational interviewing is only for ambivalence?
It's the same problem, and I think it's a serious one. That motivational interviewing gets pigeonholed as being only relevant to the should I or shouldn't I question, and not to the can I, can't I question. And in truth, uncertainty and ambivalence arise for both of those reasons. At all stages of change, and in ways we still need to fully understand. It appears that in earlier stages of change, the why question is more important, and in later stages of change, the how question is more important. But I bet you we're oversimplifying it grossly to say that the moment someone's made apparently some magical decision, matters of motivation and hesitation and doubt. Yeah, it's a clinical nonsense.
You think a little ambivalence might crop up in the change process?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So it does. The stages seem to wash into each other. And even when one is in the process of action, of pursuing change, still, these are important issues.
You know, Bill was speaking earlier about motivational interviewing occurring within an interpersonal context. And if I think about the two of you developing this book and this idea about motivational interviewing in an interpersonal context, I have to wonder what the differences in your two styles brought to that discussion and that intellectual exchange.
Well, look, certainly the interpersonal context is broader than the two of us. But I think that there are quite a few other very, very talented people who are working on it. But it is possible that the contrast between our personalities characterizes some of the activities and interests and orientations of quite a large number of us. And perhaps mine is, it's no accident that I've got into briefer consultations, medical settings. My orientation tends to be quite pragmatic, less concerned with the niceties of counseling, and more with getting on with a job and training people to do things well in a brief period of time. That tends to be the way I've gone the last few years. And that probably is a personality thing, a sort of more pragmatic edge to my interest in recent years.
Oh, it is. I mean, Steve brought a real lively life, I think, to motivational interviewing, and I've very much enjoyed our work together in that regard. Taking it into other settings that I certainly hadn't thought about, making me be very specific and not conceptual and philosophical about things, but saying, fine, but how do you actually do it? The very same thing those Norwegian psychologists did with me. I've insisted sometimes that Steve be a little more logical and kind of follow a stream of thought, and we specify the steps to things, and I think those differences have just been quite lively and very good, and what we have is so much better than if either one of us had done it individually.
We've talked a bit about some of the conceptual underpinnings of motivational interviewing, but let's get very practical here for a moment. What are the practical, hands-on principles of motivational interviewing?
This is one place where Steve's been very helpful, and we worked together to try to clarify essential principles that were not in the original paper. We usually start with, as a first principle, expressing empathy. And we put it first because of our sense that that is really fundamental to motivational interviewing. That you must be able to do reflective listening, Carl Rogers' sense of empathy well. This doesn't have to do with having had the same experience oneself. In the addiction field, that gets emphasized sometimes. But the evidence is that having had an alcohol or drug problem oneself makes you neither a better nor a worse therapist. It just doesn't really have any impact on outcomes. And the kind of empathy that makes a tremendous difference from the research is this ability to suspend one's own material and advice for the time being and really listen and understand what the other person is saying. And that's something much needed in I think, all of the healing professions. Mm-hmm. And we emphasize that as a fundamental point in motivational interviewing.
Can I move on to the second principle?
Fine.
With that as a starting point, because behavior change is the topic, and because there's a potential for conflict in value systems, it's very difficult to avoid a sort of an itchy potential for disagreement. I don't tend to disagree with clients who's suffering a bereavement. It doesn't seem to have that itch to it. But in behavior change discussions, it's got that potential for disagreement, and so avoiding argumentation we feel is critical.
It's a particular kind of argument. It's where you, as a helper, take the good side. Right. You have a problem you don't recognize, and you must do this about it. And that's done with the best of intentions. But if you look at the social psychology of it, you're really eliciting from the other person what gets called resistance, but is simply the other side of the argument. And that, in turn, tends to back the person into the corner. So when you find yourself in that position of, I'm doing the arguing for change here, and the client is arguing against it, you're in the wrong spot. And you need to get out of that spot. And that's what we're talking about in avoiding argument.
One quick point about that is we're not talking about fighting. Argument means different things in different cultures, but it can take very subtle forms. And probably the most common is a quiet acquiescence, where the person just becomes progressively more and more passive. Question then becomes, well, how do you avoid argumentation? And then that's the third principle we thought of, which is rolling with resistance, which can be defined both simply and in very elegant forms. There's a wide variety of ways of describing it. But it has to do with a lightness of touch and not meeting resistance head-on in any way.
It's not like boxing. You're not pushing against what the person brings you. The family systems therapist, Jay Haley, I think of in particular, made an analogy to judo, of using momentum of the person to move them along, rather than just trying to stop it, which is very difficult. And so instead of arguing, it's working with the person. And we will, on the subsequent tape, be talking about some very specific ways of doing that.
But the feeling should be what? What feeling should the therapist have or not have in order to be adhering to those principles?
Well, the rolling with resistance, when I observe it in other people, which gives you some sense of detachment, there's a quality of not taking the bait. There's a quality of acceptance that this is difficult for the person.
And joining.
And joining with them despite this resistance. That's what you notice.
Well, and clients say that. And also, when you take this approach with people, it's obviously not what they expected very often. People come in expecting to be told what to do, or to be blamed or labeled or diagnosed or given some sort of very directive advice. And this surprises people. It's not quite what they expected. And so there's this wonderful resonance of joining on the part of the helper and a sort of surprise relief on the part of the client.
When it's working well.
When it's done well. What else would you say were underlying principles for motivational interviewing?
Well, self-efficacy would be the fourth.
Supporting self-efficacy. We've made a number of points about this so far in this discussion. That it's all very well for somebody to decide that it's worthwhile to change. The how to do it is critical. And supporting someone in that process, I don't think we know enough about to be incredibly dogmatic about what's the best way of doing it. But I think we know, it can be useful to frame it this way. We know what probably isn't a good idea, which is to focus on, is for the therapist or the practitioner to identify a single simple solution, molecular if possible, and suggest it to the person. And it's actually a more complex process of negotiation and confidence building. And that's quite a skill. And we would hope that motivational interviewing can embrace that skill, because it's a delicate dance and resistance is not uncommon.
Another way of thinking about it is that if you simply bring a person along to the place of anxiety, to the place of seeing that there's a need for change or they're in some danger, but you don't persuade them there's something they can do about it, you really haven't got anywhere. They're still not going to move. This is a fundamental message of health beliefs models, that it takes both the recognition of a need for change and the belief that that change is possible. And together those create the electricity and that crazy wiring diagram I had in the original article that gets people moving.
So without the emphasis on self-efficacy, you might just agitate people about the problems they have without really helping them to move on.
And in fact, you can predict what will happen. And this is well documented in research. If you create alarm, if you create the perception of risk, and there is no escape, there's no sense of a good way out, something I can do about this, people then go into what Anna Freud would have talked about as defense mechanisms to reduce the fear. So you begin to rationalize or minimize or do things to say it really isn't all that bad, or just forget about it, because we don't like living with anxiety over a long period of time. If there's nothing you can do about it, then you want to just change your thinking in a way so it isn't a threat any longer. And that may get labeled resistance, but it's quite a predictable result of alarming a person without giving them hope. And then the fifth one would be developing discrepancy, which in a way is the most complex of them. I started out, and I regret this to some extent, thinking about this from the standpoint of cognitive dissonance. And in the first article on motivational interviewing, wrote about trying to create that cognitive dissonance. I think that assumes a drive state that you don't really need, and that the broader way of thinking about this is to help the person to saliently realize that where they are and where they want to be are at some distance from each other, that there's a discrepancy between what they're doing and things that they hold very dear. That's how the values come back in. And there are a number of specific strategies in motivational interviewing for helping to develop that discrepancy, which, when done well, moves the person out of the ambivalence and on into behavior change.
Yeah, and there's two issues arise there. One's ethical. Who are you to make someone feel uncomfortable? And we have tried to answer that kind of question earlier on in this discussion. The other question that it raises is, what sort of skills do you need to doing that? And it's in relation to this principle that I think we need to be mindful of too wide an expansion of motivational interviewing to cover too broad a range of practitioners who perhaps do not have the competencies in listening skills. And this is an unanswered question. How wide can you go? But I would say this particular principle is something that requires delicate handling in practice. And it needs to be done with integrity and great care and respect for the person.
So one common misconception about motivational interviewing then would be that it's a panacea for every problem. Do you see other common misconceptions about motivational interviewing, or things that kind of bother you or disturb you that people are saying or thinking about it?
Misconceptions. The most common one is that, we do this anyway. I mean, be interested to hear how you resolve that. When I resolve, we do it anyway and it's good counseling. Sorry. Yeah,
so there's nothing new about it.
There's nothing new about it. And the way I resolve that is absolutely, it is on a platform of high quality counseling skills. But because there's a focus on behavior change, and because there's the itchy potential conflict of value systems, there is a need for directiveness. So it's a combination of client-centered and directive strategies, the use of directive strategies in order to help people resolve behavior change difficulties. And I think that's something which the work that we've done and other people has just started our process of understanding it. There's lots more to investigate.
I've had the same experience of people in workshops saying, well, I already do all these things. This is just basic counseling. And I guess my usual response in a workshop, at least, perhaps with a little bit of maliciousness, is to say, show me. Okay, let's see how you do it. And it turns out in practice not to be as easy to do this as one thinks. In fact, reflective listening itself is quite a difficult skill. Sounds easy. You can make it look easy if you're good at it. You can parody it very nicely. But actually doing that and following people through the course of their lives and their struggles with reflective listening is not a simple skill to do. And then managing that at the same time as keeping track of the direction that you're going and monitoring discrepancy and remembering the pieces that people have given you so you can go back and summarize them is quite complex. And although the intention is there, it isn't quite so easy to do. And I hope that what we do in our training is to help people be able to convert that intention, that this is sensible to them, into skillfulness to actually be able to do this.
What are you hoping to achieve with these videos?
I think it's fairly simple. And in a way it's the same thing that I had hoped to achieve with an earlier tape that we did, just to show what it looks like. We consciously avoided commercial production quality. We consciously avoided high cost. We simply want to have an opportunity to talk about motivational interviewing and to show a variety of skillful people doing this with a variety of scenarios and a variety of settings. And there's nothing quite like seeing it, I think, that makes it helpful. So at least my hope has been that we can get some models of good motivational interviewing out there that will be helpful to people in learning and understanding what this is about, and to do that at a low cost.
And obviously, with all our talk about client behavior change, learning new methods is therapist behavior change. And we're hoping these videos can play a small part in helping that process.